How do you take your tea?
Well, if it's a choice, Kamal, I will go for English breakfast.
Yes.
With a spot of milk.
Yes.
And in budget week, I might ask for a drop of whiskey in there somewhere. But if you're not offering that because you're too broke, then I'll stick with the tea.
We do have, I think it is pretty much English breakfast. Whilst I pour it, Gordon, you can kick off a bit of the chit-chat.
Yeah. Well, we were going to ask you, I think, did you enjoy being Chancellor? Or is it a job where all your colleagues hate you? Or do they all have to sort of suck up to you? And do you think Rachel Reeves is enjoying it?
There's a very good question. I think perhaps she's realising that in politics there is a golden rule that you tend to look forward to jobs rather more than you actually enjoy doing them. But I love doing that job. It's the best job in British politics in many ways. But if you actually want to change things, you can do so much as Chancellor. There's this kind of weird thing about the job where you take a huge number of decisions. So if you think the reason I want to go into politics is to make the world a better place, apart from being Prime Minister, there is literally no other job. However, the unwritten rule is that you don't get the credit for it because that is for other departments. But I look back on, for example, the decision to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, which I'm still hoping and praying the current government will live up to. And, that was a huge decision, one of the ones I was most proud of. If that is matched by France and Germany, then NATO will spend an extra $182 billion, more than matching Putin's war machine. So it's an absolutely huge decision. Being Chancellor is like that. You get those really, really big decisions, and that is a huge privilege. Is it easy? No. And the price you pay is that you have to go through budgets, autumn statements, which can often be very hairy occasions. But I would say doing stuff like that is why you go to politics.
Given that you were Chancellor under Liz Truss, more hairy for you than maybe many of your predecessors. But as Chancellors, that's quite a small club. You're actually quite matey with Rachel Reeves. You WhatsApp each other, and I suppose you know what the job is actually like. So even though in public maybe you are very critical and she's critical of you and you're critical of her, actually you're quite chummy.
We don't go out for drinks together, but I have a lot of respect for her, and we have a friendly relationship outside politics. But that doesn't mean that I don't worry that on Wednesday we are going to see the biggest assault on British economic competitiveness in our lifetimes, and that is something that will be enormously damaging, not just for the prosperity of individuals at home, but also for our ability to fund things like the NHS. So I think it's perfectly possible to have big disagreements with people about what they do, but have a cordial and friendly relationship, and I hope that's what we do.
You say that the biggest in our lifetimes. Is there a particular sort of Chancellor that you would compare this with? I mean, how far do we have to go back?
Well, I think that it is going to do the most damage to the economy since Dennis Healey said that he would squeeze the rich until the pips squeaked in 1974. I was 8 years old when that happened. I won't pretend I could remember him actually delivering those words. But that is the risk. And every Labour government in history has ended up running out of money and with the need for desperate cuts to public services. And I'm worried that's what we're going to see in the end as the unintended consequence. I'm sure the intentions behind what they do will be perfectly honourable, but the unintended consequence, if you damage our competitiveness, for example, the increase in employers' national insurance that we know is going to happen, will mean fewer jobs, lower wages, and less investment and therefore less growth. So that was something that I considered when I had a £72 billion black hole ahead of the autumn statement in 2022. That was a real black hole, not a fictional one. And I looked at all the options on the table. I rejected that one because I knew it would do enormous long-term damage. you can't, just because businesses don't vote doesn't mean there isn't a lasting impact. And I think what we are going to see is one of the most jobs-destroying budgets that we will ever remember.
Let's get into the detail of the budget in a few minutes, but I just wanted to rewind a little bit. You've mentioned the fictional black hole that you're saying that Rachel Reeves has claimed that she discovered after getting into number 11. Clearly what Labour is trying to do, they're telling a story, aren't they, to the country? They made promises before the election that taxes wouldn't rise on working people, and we might want to ask what is a working person, and they've obviously struggled to define that. But it is also, but since the election, they have then said, we discovered all these problems that were left here by the previous government and by you, Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, where they've had to increase taxes, increase borrowing to fill that black hole. And this is the charge sheet. Underfunded asylum system, underfunded transport system, costs for Ukraine not properly accounted for, hospitals not built, public sector pay deals not agreed or funded. What truth is there to that the public finances were in a mess when Rachel Reeves arrived in number 11, and the government has to fix that before they can do other things?
There is no truth in this black hole fiction. Let's be absolutely clear. Were there pressures in public finances? Of course, there are always pressures. What Rachel Reeves will discover in a year, 2 years, 3 years' time is that chancellors always have to deal with pressures. But alongside those pressures was a plan to deal with them. And in the end, this is about choice. I don't want public services to go back to austerity. I'm someone who believes in good, high-quality public services, whether the NHS, schools, our police or our armed forces. Absolutely to the core of my being, I want well-funded public services. But how you secure that funding is a political choice. Now, what we would have done as Conservatives is said that if you take difficult decisions on welfare reform, you don't just get more people into the workforce, which is beneficial economically, helps businesses find the staff they need, but you also release funds for public services. If you increase productivity in the public sector, again, the OBR say that there is 20 billion of funding to be saved if we return public sector productivity to pre-pandemic levels. Now, those are difficult things to do. I don't want to pretend otherwise. We were prepared to take those difficult decisions. In fact, I announced in the budget in the spring a productivity plan for the NHS, which gave them 3.4 billion for a new complete overhaul of their IT system in return for a commitment to a 2% increase in productivity every single year over the next 5 years. Difficult decisions. It means taking on the unions. It means making the argument for a better welfare system. Now, if you don't want to take those difficult decisions, then the only choice you have is to help yourself to other people's money by raising taxes. And the point I want to make is that it may look like it's an invisible goose that you're plucking when you increase business taxation. But actually, every economist, Rachel Reeves herself has said, the only way that you get higher GDP per head growth, higher living standards, is by raising productivity. That means more investment. If you hit company profits with a massive hike in employers' national insurance, you will reduce the amount of money they have to invest. That will be less jobs, less growth, less money for the NHS.
Can we, before we get on to some of the other details that are in the budget, couple of things. Winter fuel allowance, which is obviously one of the most controversial measures that Labour has announced before the budget. Rachel Reeves has said that the reason she had to cut winter fuel was basically your fault because of this alleged black hole. Did you ever consider cutting winter fuel payments? And if not, why didn't you?
Well, it's one of a number of options that were presented to me. And
Actually, Mr. Could you just run us through that? How does it work as Chancellor? When you say there's a number of options, do the Treasury come in with sort of documents about things you can do, and how about winter fuel allowance, and you just say that would be ridiculous? How does it actually work in the department?
well, what happens is that you are presented at the start of a budget process with this giant double-sided A3 piece of paper, which is literally and figuratively the biggest spreadsheet you've ever seen in your life, because every number on that spreadsheet is a billion. So if it says 2,450, that is £2,450,000,000. Anything less than a million doesn't get a look in.
A billion doesn't get a look in, or less than a million doesn't get a look in. Yes, yeah.
And so these are enormous numbers. And then and you soon learn as Chancellor that the number you really want to look at is on the back page, bottom right, and that is the gap that needs to be broached either with higher taxes or cuts in spending in order to meet your fiscal rules. And so the Treasury will show that number. And so you go through the process. So, as I say, when I became Chancellor in October 2022, the gap we had was 72 billion. And I, by the way, had markets collapsing around my ears. It was a very, very challenging period. And so the Treasury then said, well, this is what you could do. And so obviously in those contexts, things like winter fuel payments are considered. The reason it was a pointless decision is everyone can understand the illogicality of a millionaire pensioner getting a £300 help towards their heating bill. But by cutting universal access to winter fuel payments, you are depriving 2/3 of the pensioners in poverty, 2/3 of them, of the way that they are going to help pay their fuel bill. And I was very proud that over the 14 years my party was in government, despite all the difficult decisions we had to take with, for example, a Labour government that had run out of money, with the pandemic, with the energy crisis, we still reduced the number of people living in absolute poverty by over 1 million. And I think that's a very important part of a balanced Conservative mission, to say, yes, we will take the tough decisions for the long run, but we are going to keep a watchful eye on the impact those decisions have on ordinary people. Now, this decision is going to hit pensioners in poverty. It's taken at the same time as a decision to give train drivers on 60 grand a 10 grand pay rise without any request for additional productivity concessions. It was an immoral decision to make that choice in that way, and that's why I went completely against it.
And do you think it's just a terrible political decision? I mean, it feels to me that it's going to rebound on them really badly. Were you surprised that almost would you say they fell for it? Were you surprised at that?
Well, it was politically inept, for sure. But that's not the real point. The real point is that there are, in the end, because there's been a big increase in the number of pensioners claiming pension credit, which gets you the winter fuel allowance, it's not likely to save them money. It probably costs them money, actually.
Yeah.
And so it was financially inept, politically inept, but actually it was morally inept to give in to the unions in the way they did, at the same time as taking money off poor pensioners. I think you've got to ask yourself, where's the moral compass in that?
Is there a bit of naivety there as well? You come in, you haven't been in government for nearly 15 years. All the preparation you can do, you get this very serious looking spreadsheet across all these things, and the winter fuel allowance looks relatively simple in terms of what you've been offered. We were saying, Gordon, weren't we, as we were talking before you came in to talk to us, does it show a naivety about how things land politically? The complaint has not been just about the decision, but about there was no context. It just suddenly happened out of a clear blue sky. They'd never mentioned it.
Well, I think here's the real naivety that we're about to see. I mean, we didn't quite finish the discussion about pressures on public finances, because whilst there is absolutely not a 22 billion black hole, there is long-term pressure on how we fund public services like the NHS with an ageing population. And the big argument amongst economists ahead of the election was whether the 1% spending assumption that I put in place, with Labour's support, by the way, in the autumn of 22, which said that public spending was going to go up by 1% a year in real terms. Lots of people, like Paul Johnson at the IFS, said it's not enough. And our plan was to deal with that by improving productivity and welfare reform, as I mentioned. Labour's plan is to increase taxes. They need the 22 billion as cover to do that. What is naive is to think that people will forgive them after promising, as Rachel Reeves did, 30 times this year ahead of the election. Not just that she didn't want to increase tax, that she wouldn't increase tax, but actually she wanted to bring taxes down. She said consistently, I think the tax burden is too high. She said, I don't think the future of public services is to find more money by increasing taxes. She said this over and over again, and she thinks people are going to forget that. But actually that is a very big thing. 17 weeks after you've been elected, having promised so consistently that you had no plans to increase taxes other than the relatively small ones that you've outlined. To do that is something that will make people very angry indeed.
Mm-hmm. You're quite angry with the Office for Budget Responsibility, aren't you? On the front page of today's Telegraph, you were complaining about the fact that the head of the OBR, is going to bring out a report on Budget Day on the pre-election public finances. It's going to answer that question about the £22 billion alleged black hole. And you're now cross, I think, aren't you, that you're not going to see that letter, that report, before the budget. So you're going to have to respond to the budget without seeing that. Rachel Reeves is going to see it before the budget. And you're basically accusing the OBR of being biased.
Well, it is a fundamental principle in our constitution that governments don't have access to the papers of their predecessors. And, but what's happened this time...
Why is that important? Sorry, yeah.
Why is that important? Because it's to stop governments doing a trawling exercise to dredge up things that they can then accuse their predecessors of doing out of context and without their predecessors having a right of reply. So there's a fundamental principle. Now, the OBR said that it wants to examine a lot of the exchange of information between the Treasury and the OBR ahead of the spring budget when I was Chancellor. They say this is not political, and they're not going to criticise the decisions made by former ministers. But Rachel Reeves told the Sunday Times the opposite. She told them that this report was going to nail Sunak and Hunt. And she's read the report and I haven't. And not only that, but the OBR haven't approached me at any stage. If they did, I could have explained to them exactly why our plans were credible and realistic and how we would have made sure that we continue to live within our fiscal rules. But they didn't ask me. And the reply I got from the OBR last night made it even worse because it makes it clear that they have decided that Rachel Reeves is allowed to see this report and use it in her budget speech. And I won't be able to. I won't have seen it. I'll find out exactly the same time as the public find out. And I'm afraid that is a clear breach of the OBR's responsibility to be constitutionally impartial. And as someone who strongly supports the OBR, I think it's incredibly damaging if the OBR does political favours for the government of the day and does things that that no fair-minded person would say is reasonable, which is what's happening this time.
What do you think? What do you think should happen? You've just said that you've just accused them of giving political favours and not following any sort of due process, given that you haven't seen the allegations that are going to be possibly made on Budget Day. What should happen?
What they should do is say, if we want to do this inquiry, my view is absolutely fine. In fact, I welcome it. But let's sit down and let's talk to Jeremy Hunt and all the people who were in office at the time to hear how they plan to deal with pressures. And then we will publish the report in a completely neutral way, not at a time designed to give maximum political advantage to the government of the day.
Now, in a parallel universe, Jeremy Hunt, you could have been delivering this budget. You could have said to the Prime Minister, which maybe you did do, the previous Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, don't go early to an election. Let's hold on until the end of the year. I'll have the chance to do another budget. The economic news will be better, and we will have a better chance of winning the next election. Looking back now, do you think the decision to go early was the wrong one, given that we could be talking to you as the Chancellor about to deliver a budget?
Well, I think with the benefit of hindsight, it probably is the case that we shouldn't have gone early, although I'm not as convinced as many people are that it would have made that much of a difference. I think the British public had made up their minds, and I don't think hanging on would have changed that in any substantive way. Yes, I would have relished the chance. What I would really wanted to do is to be delivering the first budget of a new parliament in which I was able to set out plans to make us the most dynamic, entrepreneurial, innovative economy in Europe that is then able to generate all the funds we need for public services. And I would have been prepared to take very difficult decisions on productivity and welfare reform to get us there. That, I'm afraid, is what we're not going to hear on Wednesday.
So let's just say, let's imagine that you were still Chancellor and we were in that situation where Rishi Sunak had delayed the calling the election till the winter. What would have been in your budget? And is there anything that Rachel Reeves is doing that you would have done as well?
Well, it's difficult to predict because what I can't now see is the core fiscal and economic forecasts that Rachel Reeves has, which, as Kamal will know from your previous incarnation, are very important because they tell you how much headroom you've got to play with. But my priority was always long-term growth, getting people into work. That's why I didn't just do welfare reform, but we did the childcare reforms, the abolition of the lifetime allowance on pensions. So you can see that my direction of travel would have been support for public services, but also efficiency improvements and things that made the British economy more competitive. And, just in case any Telegraph listeners or viewers have forgotten, at the time of the last election, the International Monetary Fund said the UK economy would grow faster than France, Germany, Italy or Japan over the following 6 years. So we left an economy with tremendously good growth prospects, and I would have been wanting to build on those.
Were you lining up any tax cuts?
I think tax cuts are something that you do when you have an opportunity, but it's impossible to know whether we'd have had that opportunity. For example, I didn't know until 3 weeks before the autumn statement a year ago that I was going to be able to afford to do full expensing, that incredibly important business tax cut that incentivises investment. It cost £11 billion a year. And it wasn't until the numbers changed right at the last minute that I knew that I would be able to do that. But if you're asking me, do I believe that countries with the most successful economies have lower levels of taxation? Well, they do. I mean, that is just a fact. Look at North America, look at Asia. Those countries, you can see there is more dynamism, more entrepreneurialism, and lower levels of tax than in Europe, where we have much higher levels of tax. Now, the central question for us as a country is how do we get those higher quality public services and competitive tax rates? And I think the answer to that is we need to dramatically modernise the way we deliver public services so that we are indeed able to deliver better services at lower cost.
Rachel Reeves, as well as increasing taxes, has made it clear that borrowing is also going to change. She's going to tweak or change the fiscal rules. Many economists say that is actually the right thing to do, as long as that new borrowing is done for investment. You have made the point at the end of last week that any new borrowing leads to a threat of higher interest rates, which in the end feed through to people's mortgages. Did you have advice, which maybe she has also had, about that issue from your officials when you were in the Treasury, about the link between increased borrowing and higher interest rates. You could just maybe explain why there is that link and maybe what advice you had.
Sure, at risk of getting very economically technical, I mean, the basic issue is that if you borrow more, then the people who are lending to you ask for a higher interest rate in return for the favour. And the advice the Treasury always gave me was that an increase in borrowing of around 1% of GDP could see interest rates go up by between 0.8 and 1.25% higher than they would otherwise have done. Now, I am not against the principle of borrowing if it's going to mean that we can buy things that improve our long-run competitiveness. For example, to put in place nuclear power stations or motorways or rail lines that will increase the productivity of the economy. Indeed, that's what we've done for many years under the Conservative government. So we recognise that there is a role for borrowing in the economy. But what I would say is you've got to be really careful how you do this. And the problem with the way that the Chancellor has gone about this is that because the markets have begun to worry about a binge increase in borrowing, you've seen our bond yields go up. Now, this is a technical thing, but what it means is that the debt interest we pay as a country on our debt, which is about £1 trillion, goes up. And so the risk you have is you say, well, I'm going to change the fiscal rules to allow me to spend £10 billion a year more on all these capital projects. But oh dear, the debt interest cost has also gone up by £10 billion a year. So actually, I'm not saving any money at all. And that's the risk you have. So I think you've got to be really careful how you do it. And what you spend the money on also matters a great deal.
And why does it push through to mortgage rates?
Because that's the way the markets react to governments who say they're going to increase the national debt. They then say, well, this government is a less safe bet than, for example, the German government. I would say, though, Kamal, that we left the country with lower debt as a proportion of GDP than the United States, France, Italy, or Japan. So, in fact, the second lowest in the G7. So we left the country in a very good state. The deficit was about half the level we inherited in 2010. But it's just something you've got to be very, very careful about.
Just to put it in context, we checked before you came in. I think a 1.25% rise in interest rates would equate to an extra £177 a month on a £250,000 mortgage. So that's the knock-on effect it would have on people out there. What worries you the most about what we think is going to be in Rachel Reeves' budget?
Well, look, here's what I'm really worried about, Gordon. That the government wants to make an argument that we are raising taxes to put more money into public services. Mm-hmm. As I've explained to you, there are other ways to do that, particularly if you're prepared to take difficult decisions on welfare that they're not prepared to take. But the way they will do that will do massive long-term damage to the competitiveness of the economy. I think this is going to be the most damaging budget that we've had since the 1970s. And that won't feed through into the numbers immediately. But the trick when you're Chancellor is, aside from all the political hurly-burly, the exchanges in the House of Commons, the difficult Today programme interviews, aside from all of that, you've got to make sure that you're taking decisions for the long-term good of the economy. And what we're about to see is decisions that damage our long-term growth prospects, that make businesses invest less, employ fewer people, reduce our growth rate. But it won't happen immediately. It will be a process that happens over a period of time. And, I am a big believer in the potential of our country. I think that we've got incredibly good growth prospects. We've got the biggest tech sector in Europe, one of the biggest in the world. Our vaccine saved more lives across the world during the pandemic than those discovered in any other country. So we've got incredible potential. But that does mean you have to have a Chancellor who is prepared to take decisions for the long-term health of the British economy, even if those decisions are difficult. And I think we're going to see the opposite on Wednesday. And, you know, my kids are 10, 12, 14. I want them to be as optimistic about our future as I have been. This budget is going to take us in the wrong direction.
Just a couple more questions before you have to leave us. Moving away from the budget and what's going to be happening this week, have you voted yet to be on who should be the next leader of the Conservative Party?
Yes, I have.
And could you tell us who you voted for?
I'm afraid not. I've said that I'm going to. This is one of the most enjoyable things of the last few months, having participated rather unsuccessfully in leadership contests for the Conservative Party the last 3 times. I have stepped back. I've voted in every opportunity, but I am going to stay publicly and privately neutral. So I haven't even told the person I'm voting for.
What would you like to do next?
Well, you know, I think being on the backbenches presents its own opportunities for public service.
And you're committed to that, to staying?
Absolutely committed to staying. Otherwise, I wouldn't have fought one of the most closely fought election campaigns in the country. You know, my great hero, without wanting to over-flatter myself with comparisons, but my great hero has always been William Wilberforce, who did something more historic than pretty much any MP in history, perhaps bar Winston Churchill, by getting the slave trade abolished. And he was only ever on the backbenches. He was never a government minister. So I think you can do great things in Parliament from the backbenches.
Do you have a particular cause that you want to fight?
I'm writing a book at the moment about Britain's role in the world. And I'm really worried that there is so much negativity, pessimism, declinism, that we are going to retreat into our shells at one of the most dangerous moments of the world in our lifetime. And, you know, the argument I want to make is, look, whatever the decision facing the world, the big decisions, whether it's, you know, what Russia is trying to do to threaten our security, the threat to democracy from China, climate change, the risks of artificial intelligence, whatever those decisions are, you say, what are the most influential countries in the world to help sort them out? We're always in the top 10. If you say just democracies, we're always in the top 5. We have a lot more influence around the world than we give ourselves credit for. But if we're going to tackle these problems, we've got to get out there, get stuck in, pursue the global vocation that's always been a very, very important part of our destiny.
I hope you will come back onto the podcast to discuss the book when it's published.
Thank you, Kamal. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you very much, Jeremy Hunt.